is something that has worked for me 100% of the time.
Hey guys, I'm Leila. Welcome back. Today we are going to look at watercolor hacks. You know, those little tips and tricks that can be so useful and can make a big difference between having a painting that looks okay to wow, how did you do that? So if you're interested, please make sure to watch all through till the end, because we're going to look at some really cool and unusual things.
So, hack number one. When you have completed your watercolor, it's dried, and then you take a look at it and you realize that you have some kind of a spot somewhere that you didn't want it to be there. It's a mistake. You don't know what to do because everything is dry. Your paper is 100% dry. How can you get rid of something like this? Well, you can use something sharp like a needle or a knife. If it's something very small, you can use a needle. If it's something a little bit larger, you can use a knife or anything that would have a sharp sort of an end on the side. So what would you do is you would actually scrape that little spot off. You see, now I've got this white little bit there. So if that spot would have been a mistake, I've just used my knife to pick at it. If you have a really nice thick watercolor paper, you can even put highlights through in such a way. So for example, you've finished all of this, but you wanted to have, I don't know, white sort of specks. You can create that by just removing the very top thin layer of the paint to reveal the white paper underneath. I don't suggest relying on this as your highlight placer, just because it damages the paper and you can still see, that there's something there. So there are other things like masking fluid and other things that you'd be able to see in my other watercolor videos. But if you have made a mistake or something that you have noticed, when you've already finished your work and it's completely dry, if there is something that you need to remove, there you go, you can erase it to white. So I hope if something like this happens, remember, don't panic. There's always this last case scenario that you can use. Let's see another situation. Perhaps you might like to add something extra, or perhaps there's an area that you would like to remove or lighten a little bit, but your artwork's already dry, like this patch over here. What can you do? Do you throw your work away and start again? What you can do is you can grab one of these. Now they've got different names. They're called magic erasers. They are actually designed for house cleaning and things like that, so you can find them in your supermarkets. They designed for removing stubborn marks of walls and things like that. So they act like two things. Number one, they act like a sponge that can absorb water and apply water onto the surface. And number two, they're quite soft, but they're also quite tough. So they're also designed to be like a mild sandpaper. If you grab one, like I already have one here, and I've dampened this corner here, they can absorb water. So when you've got this, and then what you can do is, see, this is completely dry. You can sort of go over it and you see how it picks up the paint. So it's there, it's deposited onto the eraser block itself, but you can always give it a wash. But this is the one way that you can address the situation. Again, the paint was dry, and I've used this magic block eraser to remove some of the paint. Just remember, it's not the kind of a thing that you want to be doing to your every single painting, but if something happens and you need to remove, there is a way to do it. It's not a very well-known way, but it works great.
Now, have you ever created a sketch and then did not like the finished result because your graphite pencil was showing through, and it was just taking away something a little bit from what you wanted to achieve? So let's have a look at how we can avoid that.
How often do you use your graphite pencil to sketch before you actually start applying the watercolor paint? I know I do it all the time because it helps me with object placement and many other things. Now, what happens if you draw with the regular pencil? When you start to paint, your pencil lines will stay visible. Some of you might love it. I do love it in some types of sketches and artworks where these lines actually help me define forms and shapes. But what if you want your watercolor to be so airy and so light that these marks are really annoying and they get in the way of that airiness and light way of dealing with it? Now, there are two ways to deal with that problem. Number one, you can get what seem like graphite pencils, but they're also water mixable pencils. So if you draw something like this and then you go back in with water, see, these pencil lines are washing out and becoming so much more transparent. I mean, you can still see some of it, but if you probably keep rubbing, it'll be removed completely. But there's also another way, and that's using your watercolor pencils. With watercolor pencils, the cool thing is that you can even use them the color that you would want to create whatever subject that you're using. So for example, if you're working on the red flower, you can use a red watercolor pencil. And when it comes to painting, you pretty much have invisible lines. So again, it's really up to you. You might prefer this technique, but if you don't want to have those lines, there are these two options that you can choose. Let's move on to the next hack, and that is when you're painting, and especially if you're working on the larger work, or if you're a beginner and you find it very hard to control the amount of paint, what you can do is sometimes you can create these huge puddles where it's either really stopping your work from drying or it's getting in the way, so you end up with a puddle. Now what do? You can of course grab a tissue paper and sort of try and dry it up, but the problem with that is that you can create a pattern in there. Or perhaps you don't want to remove all of the water, you just want to remove that excess. What you can do is you can use a syringe or you can use a dropper. So what you would want to do is you would want to just absorb that water back to minimize it. You see how much water I've already collected? So that way you can create the situation where you're not completely removing all of the water, but you're removing excess of it. Again, as I said, a syringe with a fine tip or a dropper would do the same job.
If you would like to know more about watercolor brushes, how to choose them, or how to look after them, please visit my Patreon page, where just for $8 a month you will be able to watch all the extra videos that I don't post here on YouTube.
As I told you in a previous video, I will show you a little hack on how to smooth your watercolor pieces after you've painted them. You can always stretch your watercolor paper prior to using it. I don't personally like to do this. If you love doing it and it works for you, go for it, definitely. But I personally find that it kind of is a waste of time, because it doesn't matter which techniques I used to stretch paper, brown tape, to, you know, with self-gluing one, to use glass, to use, you know, special stretchers and things like that. It never really works out that at the end, when I've finished and the work is dry, it's absolutely and perfectly flat and smooth. It just never happened for me, even once. It gets even worse when you're working on a larger scale artwork. So what I want to show you now is something that has worked for me, I'd say 100% of the time, to improve the straightness of the paper, and probably I would say maybe 90% of improvement you can definitely see. Some situations with smaller artworks like this are pretty much 100%. So what I do is, if you have a work that you have just finished, the paint is dry but the paper is slightly damp, you can just go ahead and do that. Now if you left your artwork and it's dry, like this one, I left it for a few days now and it's dry, what you can do is you can turn it over, grab a bottle with water, something with a nice fine spray, and just spray it lightly on the back. You don't want to do it at the front, because it will affect your paint. But doing it in the back, should not do this. So then you want to spread it all out, and it's already getting damp. I can feel it getting damp. So then what you want to do is you want to place some clean paper underneath, place this on top, maybe another clean piece of paper, and then you want to grab something flat and heavy, something that can completely cover your artwork, the size of your artwork. Now in my case here, I've got a very heavy large book that I'm going to place on top, and I can leave it overnight, and in the morning when I lift it up, it will be nice and smooth and flat. Now for those of you who work on larger scale works, try to work on your sketch while it's within the pad. That way you already have that smooth area, and you can just, you know, put it flat and apply, you know, maybe a few books or something like this, or maybe even a board like this one with a book on top of it, because you do want to have that really flat area. You don't want to have a weight here and a weight here and no weight in between, because that will give you a bubble. So you want something that would completely press over your entire artwork. Okay, so now that it has been a few hours, let's have a look at what we have achieved with this technique. Now have a look at this. See how smooth and straight it is. All of those little bumps that we had, these are all gone. If you still have bumps, remember, you can always repeat this process many times until you have it as smooth as you are happy with. I mean, as straight. Why do I keep saying smooth? As straight as you are happy with. So this is why I don't personally like stretching paper. It takes time, but this trick, this hack, whatever you want to call it, works perfectly. Also, a lot of the times when you stretch paper with brown tape, you end up losing a lot of paper because you have to cut it off. And if you have to restretch your paper sometimes 2 or 3 times, you can reduce a really nice, expensive piece of watercolor paper from this size to pretty much this size. But again, if this is something that you love doing and you always stretch your paper before you work on watercolor, keep doing this, but do give this little hack a go as well. It works, in my opinion, perfectly. Let's have a look at the next hack. Now you're happily painting and you're painting, but outside it's a lovely relaxing day, but it's raining a lot and the humidity in the air is going up and up and up. And I constantly find myself in a situation like this because I live in New Zealand and it's really humid. Sometimes it feels like we're living underwater. So it can take few hours for something like this to dry. But if you're in a rush, if you want to complete your work faster, or you just, you're impatient, what can you do? Well, there are different things that you can do. Of course, you can put it near the heater, but it'll make your paper buckle even more. You can resort to using a hair dryer. So this is what I wanted to talk about today. If you are using a hair dryer to dry your works, there are right and wrong ways of doing that as well. First of all, you have to make sure that your hands are dry. I actually know a person who was killed because she was using a hair dryer with damp hands and she got electrocuted. But what you want to do is preferably use your hair dryer on something that is somewhat dry. So if you have a puddle, what will happen is that the directions are going to go in different ways, pretty much. So like, for example, see how there's quite a bit more water here. I'll actually exaggerate that point by adding more water and more paint so that I can show you what would happen. What you also want to do is you want to hold your hair dryer quite far away from your artwork. You don't want it pointing straight at it. You also want the lowest setting. Okay, so the fan should be on the lowest setting. Let's have a look what happens. So you see, even though my hair dryer was on the lowest setting, this area here just got a bit drier. See, I can even touch this now. But this area here is running. So unless you are trying to create this effect, I suggest not to use the hair dryer on really big spots.
Guys, I hope you've enjoyed this video. If you know any extra hacks, please let me know in the comments down below. Also let me know if you are liking these watercolor videos, or if you'd like me to show you how to use something else, or anything specific for that matter. Also, don't forget to subscribe if you haven't done so far. Give it a thumbs up if you like the video. I hope you have a great day, and as always, thank you so much for painting with me.